Who was Marco Polo? Chapter 10. The Famous Book. Marco was put in a Genoa jail for about 10 months. There wasn't much to do, and the other Venetian prisoners were probably bored. Luckily, Marco was a good storyteller. He entertained them with tales of his travels. An author named Rustichello was in the same jail as Marco. He thought Marco's stories were interesting. He offered to help turn them into a book. It was a good way to pass the time. The two men began writing. Marco told his stories aloud while Rustichello wrote them down. Marco couldn't remember everything. He decided he needed the journals he'd written in Asia, so his father sent them to the jail. No one knows how much Rustichello changed Marco's stories. The book is written in different styles, probably depending on which of the two men was writing a particular part. Other books Rustichello had written before were adventure stories about noble knights. It's likely that Rustichello tried to make Marco's stories extra dramatic. After Venice and Genoa signed a peace treaty in 1299, Marco was set free. He returned to Venice with the book he and Rustichello had written. Marco titled his book The Description of the World. Later it was called The Travels of Marco Polo. It was divided into an introduction plus 4 main parts. The introduction told readers about the Polos making 2 trips to China and meeting Kublai Khan. Part 1 was about Marco's trip across Asia toward China. Part 2 described Kublai's empire. Part 3 was about Japan, which Marco never visited, and Marco's trip home from China to Venice. Part 4 wasn't really about his travels. It described Mongol wars. In his book, Marco didn't write much about everyday things, conversations he had or friends he'd made in Asia. These things would be very interesting to readers today, but Marco didn't think readers of his day would care about such information. The Travels of Marco Polo is mostly a geography book, telling about the lands the Polos visited. Just 55 years after he died, Marco's book was used to help create a famous world map. The original version Marco and Rustichello wrote in jail has never been found. No one knows how many copies of the book were made. In Marco's day, books were handwritten by monks in monasteries using goose quill pens. It took between 3 months and 3 years to make a beautifully illustrated book, so there weren't many books around. About 150 handwritten copies of the book are now in museums and other collections. No 2 are exactly alike. A good printing press wasn't invented until the 1440s. In 1477, Marco's popular book was machine printed for the first time. The first copies were in the German language. Soon the book was reprinted in English, Spanish, and almost every other language in Europe. No wonder Marco Polo became famous. The book is still in print. Copies can be found in many libraries today. The Gutenbergs' new printing press. About 120 years after Marco died, a German man named Johannes Gutenberg invented a new way of printing. He created a different kind of press that used separate metal letters to form words and sentences. Before Gutenberg, an entire piece of text would be engraved on a piece of metal called a plate, and all the words would be printed together at once. It was a very time-consuming process, and none of the individual words in the text could ever be used separately. But Gutenberg's individual letters were used to make up words that could be set up quickly in lines to form a page. The letters were reusable. The first books he produced on his press were Bibles. He began printing them in 1452. After the pages were printed, he sent them to a bindery. There they were glued and stitched together along one side to form a book. Because of Gutenberg, more books were published in the following 50 years that had been produced in the previous 1,000 years. Once books were cheaper and easier to get, more people learned to read. Each time Marco's book was copied, some words were changed. Sometimes that was by mistake. Mistakes were especially easy to make when the book was translated into another language. Other times, the scribe or printer changed Marco's story on purpose. For instance, when the book was translated into Irish, the printer knew his readers liked exciting stories. He made changes he thought they would like. Chapter 11. Were Marco's stories true? Most historians think Marco Polo did go to China with his father and uncle. The real question is, how much of what he claimed to see and do was stretching the truth, what we call tall tales, kind of like Paul Bunyan. In his book, he used large numbers to describe amounts, sizes, and distances. He said the Chinese city of Hangzhou had 12,000 bridges, but it had far fewer. He said that Kublai sent an army of 360,000 horsemen and 100,000 troops to fight his enemies in 1287. But there wasn't enough food near the battlefield for so many troops, nor enough grass to feed that many horses. Most people who first read Marco's stories had never traveled far from home. They didn't know much about the world. To them, Marco's stories about strange lands and people seemed too incredible to believe. They decided that the book was nothing but a million lies. This helped earn him the nickname Marco Millions. For a while, another phrase for an exaggeration was a Marco Polo. At carnivals, clown puppets named Marco Millions told wild stories full of exaggeration to make the crowds laugh. Some of Marco's stories really were wild. He claimed there were magicians in Kublai Khan's empire who could make glasses of wine fly. He said they could change day into night and could also turn a sunny day into a rainy one. Today, some people wonder why he didn't write about the Great Wall of China in his book. Maybe it didn't amaze him. Much of it had been destroyed by the 1200s. It was rebuilt and lengthened when the Ming family ruled China from 1368 to 1644. People also wonder why his book doesn't mention the Chinese custom of tea drinking. This may be because tea was most popular in southern China, and Marco spent most of his time in northern China. Marco wrote that he was the governor of a Chinese city named Yangzhou for 3 years, yet he never described his job. Most historians don't think he learned to speak Chinese. Therefore, it's hard to believe that Kublai chose him to govern a Chinese city. In China, historians kept careful records, but a government worker named Polo is only mentioned once. If Marco worked for the Khan for 17 years, why wasn't he mentioned more often? Did he use a Chinese name most of the time? Maybe. But it's odd that there is no record of the arrival of three Europeans in China in the 1200s. And what happened to the jewels Marco supposedly brought home? In 1300, 5 years after his return from China, he got married at age 45. He and his wife, Donata Badur, eventually had 3 daughters, Fantina, Balela, and Moretta. When he died, he didn't leave his family a great fortune. That makes his stories about going to China seem false. But a list of his belongings around the time of his death suggests that he did leave behind one of Kublai Khan's gold tablets. That makes his story seem true. Where else would he have gotten something like that, except from the Khan himself? Could he have bought it, stolen it, or had a fake tablet made? Whatever the case, Marco's book spurred on other explorers. Christopher Columbus studied it and made notes on the pages. He longed to reach China by a quicker route than Marco Polo had found. He sailed west from Spain in 1492, hoping to find China. He didn't realize that North America and South America blocked his way. Vasco da Gama was also very interested in the book. Eventually, he found a new sea route from Europe to Asia by sailing around the southern tip of Africa in 1497. The Silk Road wasn't used as much after that. Marco was 69 years old when he died in 1324. At that time, most people had decided he had made up the stories in his book. After he was dying, his friends begged him to confess the truth and say that he'd been lying. He refused. His answer to them is now famous. He told them, "I never told half of what I saw." And there's a timeline for Marco Polo. He's born in 1254. Kublai Khan becomes the ruler in 1260. They leave for Venice in 1271. Marco meets the Khan in 1275. Kublai sends him to escort the princess in 1291. Kublai Khan dies in 1294. The Polos arrive back in Venice in 1295. Marco is captured in a sea battle, and Rustichello helps write the book in 1298. 1299, Marco is released from prison. In 1300, Marco's father dies and Marco gets married. In 1324, Marco dies in Venice at age 69. In 1477, about 150 years after Marco dies, copies of his book are printed on Johann Gutenberg's new printing press.